Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we begin a 5-day program on women's history of changing the world. You know, it's a very interesting thing, history. We read our history books, and most of the books are the history of wars and conquest and exploitation and colonialism and how testosterone has ruled okay. And we seldom look under the veneer of patriarchal power and examine what is actually going on in the lives of 99% of the people, the lives of women, the lives of people of color, the lives of young people. And when we do, we realize that not only is history more complex than we can possibly imagine, but that the storyline that we receive and are told is history is generally either just a small fractal of what's really going on, or basically not what happened at all. And so this week, we're going to look at some of the subtleties of history, some of the ways in which women in particular have shaped what we know as history and have shaped a new way, an alternative way of exercising leadership and power. You know, I think, for example, of the French Revolution. We all have our images of the French Revolution, but almost none of us know of the role that women played, particularly at the beginning. It was actually a march of women from Paris to Versailles, demanding that the king take action to provide more food for the hungry. That actually ignited the revolution. And women, as the course of the revolution unfolded, played an extraordinarily powerful role in shaping the overthrow of the monarchy and the liberty and fraternity and equality that gave rise in many ways to the modern era. We're going to look in American history this week principally, and it's worth just remembering as we think about these things, about the 2020 election. You know, we think of Biden and Trump, but it was actually people of color and women of color and young people that gave Biden his majority. And it was people of color and women of color in particular in Georgia that gave the Senate to the Democrats and preserved, even though by a very slim majority, nevertheless a majority in the US Senate that was critical in preserving a semblance of a progressive agenda in the United States. And this happened again in the 22 election. So we want to look at that, and we want to look at the new models of power and leadership that ensue when you look underneath patriarchy and the coercive interactivity of men at war and the exercise of governance. So that's our program over the next 5 days as we celebrate women's history in changing and shaping the world. Before we dive into that very complex domain, very interesting and inspiring domain, let us pause, as we always do, as we begin our programs on Humanity Rising, and simply breathe together in a conscious, coherent way. The more chaos there is in the world, and we see it escalating everywhere, the more we need to deepen our internal coherence and our collective coherence And one of the most effective ways of doing that is simply by breathing together in a conscious, coherent way. So for those of you who are new, in a moment, you'll hear the sound of a bell. When you hear the bell, just begin to breathe in very slowly for about 5.5 seconds. You'll hear the sound of another bell. Just breathe out for about 5.5 seconds. If you do that, you'll take in 5.5 breaths in a minute, 5.5 liters of air. We'll take 10 breaths together, and I guarantee you'll feel more coherent, not only within yourself, but connected with all our global audience that's all breathing together as you are, as we breathe together as one. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to Humanity Rising. Thank you, everyone. It's always good to breathe as one. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce my good friend, Tom Eddington, who you've seen many times before on Humanity Rising. He's one of the pillars of what we're doing, particularly as we're giving shape to Humanity Rising Network, which is evolving day by day to increase our capacity and our global reach. Tom is a business consultant, a very successful business executive who advises and coaches people around the world. He's passionate about conscious leadership. He's also passionate about endangered species. He's the CEO and founder of Endangered Global. Also passionate about nonviolence and democracy, and has put this program together this week so that we can celebrate the effectiveness of women of color in shaping history as we know it. So Tom, thank you so much for putting this program together, and I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Jim. And I want to especially thank you for your opening comments. I always appreciate the context in which you set the week, and you always broaden the scope of the week to include the world, to include history, and I value your perspective. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
This week and putting this week together, one of the panelists who's joining us today, Janis Kearney, and I met along with her husband a couple of years ago, and I approached her about putting this week together in part because of her extraordinary journey and her extraordinary story. and then wanting to expand that out to include other women, and in particular women of color. And as I got into the programming, I was thinking about it from the perspective of my personal interest, which is conscious leadership, and looking at different models of leadership. And what happened that really surprised me was, unlike when I did weeks on biodiversity loss, where I was never questioned about not being a scientist, or doing weeks on youth mental health and not being a clinician, or doing weeks on nonviolence and not being questioned about not being an academic, not having decades of nonviolent scholarship. And yet, when I was putting this week together, I had a number of people asking me, who are you to be doing this week, Tom? You're not a woman, you're not a person of color. And it caught me by surprise. And it's had me in a personal inquiry. And, as I said, I've been looking at doing this week in part to celebrate extraordinary women who I happen to have had an opportunity to work with and have longstanding relationships with. But it was deeper than that. It was around conscious leadership and bringing a different model of leadership to the world. But it was a surprise to me to have that inquiry and that question posed to me. So I will be in my own personal journey this week as we explore this conversation and celebrate the lives of extraordinary women who have made history in the world. And I want to start by introducing Janis Kearney. Janis grew up surrounded by dirt roads, bayous, and cotton fields in the South. From those cotton fields in southeastern Arkansas, Janis's path took her many places, including her role as publisher of the Arkansas State Press, newspaper founded by civil rights legend Daisy Bates and Elsie Bates, and a personal diarist to America's 42nd president, William J. Clinton. A more recent role as founder and president of the Celebrate Maya Project, a nonprofit she and a handful of women created after the death of the iconic Maya Angelou, who we will be celebrating this week. Also joining us this morning and tomorrow and Wednesday is Shadia Alvarez. Shadia is a passionate and dedicated educator and community leader. She's a proud product of New York City public schools and of progressive education. She graduated from Antioch College with a BA in urban education, and upon graduation, served as assistant to the president for multicultural affairs, admissions, and community development, and has been brought back recently to Antioch. And so, Janis, Shadia, welcome. I'm just so delighted to be in this conversation and so appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with you over the next couple of days. And so, Janis, just, given the conversations you and I have had over the couple of years that we've gotten to know each other, I'd love for you to just share a little bit about your family history. I am just blown away by not just who your family is and who your parents were, but the distance that you've traveled in one lifetime. It's extraordinary. And so if you could share that with our audience, that would be wonderful.
Good morning, and thank you, Tom, for that introduction. Thank you to Jim Garrison as well. And thank you for honoring my history, my family, and my past. I really appreciate that. We talked a little bit before we got started about the question of, am I, capable of being a leader? And does my history and my journey, prepare me for that? And I think it can. I do think it can. But I don't think most women of color think of that as we go through life. We're just doing usually what we need to do. And unfortunately, we have this vision of leadership that doesn't always include us. But we're here to talk about changing that, right? My past has been one of great contradictions, I think you would say. I grew up very, very poor in the South. We know the South's history. We know that during my childhood, segregation was still in place. For my parents' childhood, Jim Crow was really in place. So I grew up knowing my boundaries and knowing what other people expected of me. Gratefully, I had parents who were wise enough to understand that other people who may be people who didn't look like us did not have the final say. It also had a lot to do with us, what was inside of us. And for us, faith was very, very important. My parents had 19 children. And I always tell people that I think my parents, at some point early on, they went into this little bedroom that they shared and said, what are we doing? You know, we have a huge responsibility. The children keep coming. And how are we going to make sure that we produce some children or who become grown-ups who can actually give back to the world? So I think their wisdom and their faith really, really helped them to decide what kind of parenting they needed to do, what kinds of values they needed to instill in us. And for all those years, that's what they did. I tell people that my father started teaching us before we went to school, because he understood that a lot of us were not going to be able to go to school full time because we had to help out in the cotton field during the season when he had to make his bales of cotton. So he took it on himself to teach us at home. By the time we got to school, we were ahead of some of the other students. And nobody understood that because we were absolutely the poorest family in our county, Lincoln County. But it was that wisdom of understanding what we had up against us and how we get around that. And our parents were able to instill that in us. Not only the love of education, the understanding of how powerful it was, but the values that we would need for the rest of our lives. They also instilled that in us. What I tell young people all the time, when I ask them if they dream, and some of them are actually embarrassed to say that they dream. And I always say, my parents gave us the permission to dream. They told us we could dream as big, as wild, as crazy as we could. But we had to follow up those dreams with the work that was necessary to make sure those dreams came true. So they gave us that permission and we dreamed. All those days out in the cotton fields, all those days when we went to school, sometimes without shoes, most times without money for lunch, all of the time with secondhand clothing, we were dreaming all of that time. And those dreams bear out. They allowed us to do things that we really wanted to do. My dream was being a writer. So that's what I eventually became. I have brothers who always wanted to be lawyers, attorneys. So we have attorneys and judges and educators and principals, all kinds of things. But that started down there with that ability to dream as big and wild as we possibly could. So when we talk about leadership, Tom, I think for sure I came from amazing leaders. Nobody would have thought of them as leaders, but they were my first models for great leadership. They were leaders at our home. They were leaders at our churches. They were leaders in our community, our little village. They were the community leaders. So that's what we saw. And I think that's who we modeled our own lives after. And I don't know how much. I'm going to stop right there and let Shadia talk. So.
Thank you, Janis. Listening to you is just beautiful. There's so many threads that connect. And I'll say, so, Tom, what we're trying to do here is inspire a movement for a new type of leadership. And so my life journey, in some ways, I think both through trial and challenges, but also through amazing opportunities, like Janis said, of meeting powerful people that put me in the right places. So my parents were organizers. They were community organizers, union activists. I grew up in the household where I was being the child with the crayons while everybody was yelling, Ronald Reagan is no good, send him back to Hollywood. I was that kid. I was surrounded by a number of cultural movements, social justice movements, a lot of arts, a lot of reflection, and the point my parents always made to me was, what are you going to do to contribute to the world? Mm-hmm. Don't just sit there and just think that you're going to be here, a little island on your own. What are you going to do? But what that did is that it made me really rebellious. And so what ended up happening is that through my high school experience, I was born in Puerto Rico, raised in Dominican Republic, came to New York in the 90s, end of the 80s, 90s, a difficult time for New York City. And they plopped me, and I say plopped because they plopped me in this progressive school called Central Park East Secondary School, run by Principal Deborah Meyer, who was a MacArthur genius. And I got in a lot of trouble, Tom, because I was, anti-authority. I wanted to ask a lot of questions. And she said, well, you are at the right place, Shadia, but you have to learn how to ask certain questions at certain times. It's also about rhythm. It's also about knowing that if you want to build a movement, you can't just do it, in 2 steps. It takes a long process. So I would say that my leadership view of the world and who I am within it came out of both my upbringing and my parents, but also the teachers in my high school, the educators that were around me that could help me harness all this energy into something that actually was a contribution, right? And so, Deborah Meyer took me under her wing, and I became, after that, really involved. And I ended up at Antioch College, where I'm now the executive director of the Coretta Scott King Center. And later on, I'll share a little bit about Coretta's life and in the next couple of days. But what I found fascinating is that most of us walk into leadership from either a personal experience or something that really upset us and we wanted to change. And so I really came back to this place of wanting to think about, as a woman of color, how has my leadership been colorized by my experiences? And also, how has my upbringing allowed me to not just see myself as a one-dimensional leader, but someone that is responsible to connect with other folks? And that is, I think, the biggest gift, being able to connect, being able to share, being able to learn from other folks in the service of a better society. So.
Well, thank you both for sharing a little bit about your personal journey. And I know we're going to explore it more today and tomorrow and Wednesday. But one of the things I want to do is set the frame for the next 3 days. And so I'd love for each of you to share a bit more about your relationship with the 3 women in particular we're going to be profiling: Coretta Scott King, Daisy Bates, and Maya Angelou.
Sure, I can start out because 2 of the women I think are women that I have a connection to. When I graduated from college, I graduated with a journalism degree. And I thought I wanted to do newspaper work because I had met Daisy Bates when I was 16 years old and fell in love with her and her work and her whole journey. But when I left, I was also married and had a child. I couldn't afford to work for a newspaper for what it was paying, so I went to work for state government. But in 1987, Daisy Bates, who had lost her newspaper during the 1957 Central High integration crisis, during the time of the Little Rock Nines crisis when Everybody, the whole world learned what was happening in our integration efforts. She and her husband, because they were front and center in that fight, lost all of their advertisement from white businesses. So they had to close their newspaper. That was their baby. They had no children. This was what they lived for. So it wasn't until 1984 she was able to reopen that newspaper and start it back. Her husband had died, but she started it back because they'd always wanted to do it. In 1987, they needed a managing editor. I went to her and said, Mrs. Bates, you may not remember me. I met you when I was 16 years old. You gave me a typing test. I flunked it miserably. So you did not give me a job, but here I am. I can type too. So she laughed and she gave me the job. I became her managing editor. And 3 months later, she retired. She was preparing to sell the newspaper. And I don't think I was probably as rebellious as Shadia, but I definitely was opinionated. And once I made my mind up about something, I kind of stuck to it. And I said, I know I came to this newspaper for some reason, and I'm not leaving this newspaper. So I went back in and asked her to sell it to me. And she did. She said, you have the fire in the belly that is needed for someone to run a small newspaper, especially an African American newspaper during that time. So she did sell her newspaper, and I became the publisher of that newspaper. So Daisy Bates was my hero, shero. She was the woman that I wanted to be so much like. My father introduced me to her, actually, because he was so proud of all the work that she had done for women and for children and for integration. So that's how I met her. She was just an amazing woman. So I'll talk more about her later. But Dr. Maya Angelou was someone, I read her book in college and just was blown away by I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and had a revelation that there was a lot of me in that book. She went through some things that I didn't go through, but she certainly voiced some thoughts about growing up in the South that I had experienced. So I fell in love with that book, and I wanted to be Maya Angelou. That was the second person that I really wanted to emulate. I met her when she came to the White House to as the poet for William J. Clinton's inauguration. That's when I met her. And I told her, you know, how I'd fallen in love after reading her book and all of that. So I kept up with her. We were not friends, but I definitely kept up with her. When she died in 2014, the state of Arkansas did not honor her the way that I felt like she should. She had spent much of her childhood in Arkansas. And I'll talk more about why that happened. But I felt like we should have honored her because she was a world icon. So I brought together some women and we created a day of remembrance on behalf of Maya Angelou. And after that, we decided to create a nonprofit in honor of her. And we work with schools and young people and communities in her honor. So Maya Angelou and Daisy Bates are women that I feel as if every child in this world should know. They meant so much to humanity, basically.
You know, for me, the story of Coretta Scott King has been told mostly as Coretta, the wife of Dr. Martin Luther King. And I have found it fascinating as both a student and now a person in the position to share her story and her vision of the world. It is both a blessing and it is both a responsibility. So I will say that for me, I met Coretta twice. I was very lucky as a student at Antioch College. I was one of the students chosen to give Coretta the Miss Foundation Award in New York. It was a legacy award from the Miss Foundation. And I was so nervous. I was like, how am I going to talk to this amazing human being? You know, and I was so young. And I remember going up to her and saying, you are just amazing. And I remember her looking back and saying, okay. And I thought, that's it. We're the big, powerful things that you get. But I realized it was the most human thing that we could have. It was the most human experience, because we're all taught to see these sheroes and heroes as these larger than life people, and we forget we're all human. And so the second time I met Coretta was on the campus of Antioch College. And we were trying to figure out, how do we create a center that speaks to not just who Coretta was as virtue of the legacy of Martin Luther King, but Coretta and what she believed. And it took, you know, some really clear-minded, I want to say open heart, because it meant talking about Coretta before Martin. It meant talking about Coretta as an organizer, Coretta as a peace activist, Coretta as someone that was not just singing in the church, as in some of these books say, but really organizing the folks in the church, that her voice and her belief in human rights started way before her marriage to Martin. And yet, she says herself, and in her own words, that it was the relationship that made the best of both of them even blossom to build the movement. And in Coretta's book, I'll be sharing a little later, My Life, My Love, My Legacy by Dr. Barbara Reynolds, Coretta speaks to the fact that she was in love with the movement before she was even in love with Martin. That it wasn't Martin who started the movement for her. She actually knew where she stood in the world by virtue of what she had lived through and her experiences as a child, as a daughter, and watching her father and her mother and the struggles that they encountered. Both as, you know, her mother was a bus driver and also a musician at the church. Her father was a businessman who had his lumber business set ablaze by white folks that wanted to purchase it, and he said no. So their experiences, their life experiences, actually contributed to her development and her ability to see her relationship with Martin as something that was more than just, obviously it was love, but also it was ability. A responsibility to something bigger than both of them. And you know, she talks about it really powerfully in a beautiful voice, but also she leaves us with a challenge, which is, how do we now construct this new future out of these lessons that we've learned by virtue of their experiences? How do we tell young people, yes, we want you to be a part of the movement, when the only picture that comes up for them is seeing people who have taken leadership roles killed over and over? How do we tell young people today, hey, you know, we really need to do something about, you know, whether it's, you know, criminal justice or you name it, welfare rights, without giving them enough of a coding, I will say, enough people around them to help them believe that it's actually possible. So I feel like that was Coretta's gift to us. And that's what I'm hoping to share as we go through these next couple of days. And Tom, I really appreciate you allowing us to do it, because there's a lot of story here that's really beautiful.
Well, thank you both. And I'm really looking forward to learning and exploring and sharing about these three women in particular. But before we go there, I'd love to just start and go a bit deeper in our conversation around leadership and leadership attributes. And, you know, one of the things that wasn't new to me, but the degree that humility is an essential piece of what I know about the two of you and the three women that you have profiled. And so I'd love to just explore a little bit about what have you seen in these three women in particular, and what is it in the two of you and the lives that you've lived that have enabled you to be the successful leaders that you are?
Let me start by saying that if you look first at Dr. Maya Angelou, you probably humble would not probably be the first word you would think of. But I think there's different levels of humility. I think what these women brought to the table was listening, their ability to listen, their ability to empathize, their belief in the power of inclusiveness, their belief in everybody is worthy, everyone has a voice, and that voice should be heard. I think that is what each of these women brought. And I think that's something I learned very early. I have been called humble. I have been told that I have a great deal of humility. But I do think it is the same thing that these women have. We maybe show it differently, but it's that ability to see people, to hear people, to believe in people, especially in their worth.
Mhm.
And these women, not only did they listen and make everybody feel included, but they stood up and they spoke and they said what they believed and they didn't back down. So that wouldn't be called humble, but it came from that same place. I'm doing this because there is a need for it. There are people who aren't going to stand up and speak out. I'm going to be their voice. I'm going to be the person who stands up and takes, the bricks, as Daisy Bates did. So humility is important, but I think it's at another level than just being, quiet and not having anything to say always.
That's right, Janis. And I can, speak to both the reclaiming of what that word humility has meant for me, not just watching it in the life of Coretta and reading and studying and researching, but also in the day-to-day life of the society that we're now in. And I say that to say that the word humility for some of us has been translated into being small, being meek, being quiet. And the opposite of that for me is actually what humility is. For me, humility is about being able to say that you could be in the back of the line, knowing that whatever you are contributing from the back of that line is going to help the front of that line, right? That making sure that when you are in community, that you are making sure that the voices that are not often the ones that are first to speak are the ones that are heard and listened to. That my responsibility as a leader is to make sure that humility isn't translated into being passive and small, but the ability to lift others up, because by lifting others up, you lift yourself up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody's coming up at the same time.
Right.
And that in a new way of being, it's going to require all of us to learn that in a society that teaches us the opposite. We talk about wanting to create transformational institutions. You see it now, every corporate has the banner. Yeah, that's great. But in order to do transformation, you have to start with self and collective community. If you start with role and personnel and job descriptions, you actually might have beautiful job descriptions and titles, but you don't really get to the heart of what an institution can do when it's asking its people to be more committed to lifting each other up than to competing against each other. So that's the piece on humility that I would add, Janis. This idea of passive is really hurting our young people. Because what I see in the high schools and even the early college setting is this need to have 100 titles, 100 degrees, 100 things that make you be valuable, but that's not actually what's valuable. So how do we shift that conversation?
I think part of what I heard in what you both shared, and thank you, because what I realized, as I said, humility it is often misunderstood. There's a powerful humility that each of the two of you and the women that we're profiling they hold. But the other piece that's there for me, as I understand the three women that we're discussing, but also the two of you, as I've seen, is your intention, your motivation is different. The motivation of the three women we're talking about, it wasn't about them.
Mm-hmm.
It was about society. It was about the collective interest. And that's a very different kind of leadership. And I'd love to explore that with the two of you.
I'm happy to explore that. And I can absolutely say that's true for both Daisy and Maya. Daisy, in her work, I mean, that was her life. She was kind of thrown into it. She was one of the first, and I know we'll talk more about her, but she was one of the first female NAACP presidents. And that's another subject, that there were so very few female NAACP presidents, but she was one of them and one of the youngest. And so she was kind of pushed into this role as the leader of the integration crisis that took place in 1957. And she partnered with the national NAACP, and Dr. Martin Luther King became someone who was an advisor and advocate for her. So she became a national leader because of that. As well as Dr. Maya Angelou. I mean, they worked to change. I think Maya Angelou's reason for being was to make the world better through her words, through her bravery. She also, a lot of people don't know, she worked for the civil rights struggle. She was very involved in the civil rights struggle. She and Coretta Scott King were allies and friends. She worked for Dr. King for many years until his death. And one of the things I tell people is that we never celebrate her birthday on April 4th, which is her birthday, but it's also the day that Martin Luther King died. And she never celebrated her birthday again on April 4th. So both of these women stood for something, and they stood for other people, and they stood for causes. They wanted to see the world better, and they did it in different ways. Daisy and Maya were also friends. So, there's all of this thread that goes through, but each of them in their own way definitely stood up, spoke out, put their lives on the line, took risks to make the world better.
And Janis, I'm going to read something from Coretta's biography, because I think that it speaks to this moment. And she says, who could have dreamed that a little girl who began a life as a part-time hired hand-picking cotton for $2 a week in the piercing hot sun would rise to a position that allowed her to help pick U.S. mayors, congresspersons, and even presidents? Or that in the 1950s and 60s, when a woman's place and sometimes her imprisonment defined as the home, I would be both an avowed homemaker and a liberated feminist. That I would be able to help build a human rights movement that was not just about my children, my 4 beautiful children, but also about everyone else's children. It speaks to that sense of it being more than just me and my family and my circle. Mm-hmm. But if I want our nation, and someone said 8 generations, to be whole and complete, it requires for all of us to be working in securing that for everyone.
Absolutely.
No easy feat.
No.
Well, I don't want to spend much time talking about the current public figures that we have in Congress or in Washington, D.C., but I can't help but notice the contrast between the kinds of leadership qualities that we're talking about compared to what's being celebrated in our society and what's happening in Washington, D.C. It's heartbreaking. But other qualities or attributes that we want to talk about, in particular with the two of you that you've embraced and you've used as part of your leadership style in helping you succeed, or attributes of the three women we're profiling.
So, Janis, I'm just going to jump in here, Tom, because I want to just add something that you sparked in me when you just spoke, and that for me, there's the political environment that we're in right now, right? And we can go back and forth about whether that's different, whether social media has made it more intense, et cetera, et cetera. But where I'm really hurting for myself, for my family, for my community, is in watching my children have to decipher those images. And that for us, in thinking about how we build, this new way of being that allows us to all be whole and complete, it also means taking responsibility for helping our children in a very multi-generational way think about how they see leadership, right? When my daughter's able to articulate, mommy, that person, usually CNN, mommy, that person sounds like a bully. And I have to then sit down and say, okay, well, let's figure out where your thinking is coming from. What is it that you're picking up? What's the message this person is trying to say? And why are you perceiving it as a bully? Because it would be too easy to say to her, oh, yeah, they're a bully, right? I need to be able to unpack it with her. My daughter's 10 years old. Well, one of my daughters is 10 years old. Because my concern is that if she goes to school and assumes that that is good leadership, she's going to do that, right? And then she's going to do it to other kids. So that's, Tom, you sparked that, and I didn't want to miss that, because oftentimes we don't talk about the responsibility of leadership in a multi-generational way as well.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, Shadia. I would say that one of the things these last, 10 years, 8 years have sparked in me was the need for good leadership, and specifically political leadership. When I go out and speak to young people, I am urging them to get involved, to become leaders, to become involved in politics. Politics is not the ugly word. It is the people who make it ugly. It is the people who get into it for horrible reasons. So I'm pushing politics to young people, good politics that can make a difference. I happen to believe in whatever your politics is. I happen to believe that I work for a man who went into the office wanting to make the world better. Lots of things happened, good and bad, but his whole reason for being there was to make the world better for everyone. That is what good politics is. And I would like to think that our children can be encouraged and guided and given the opportunity to become our next leaders. We need them, and we really need to start pushing them into that. That's what I think. My own personal decision over this COVID era was that whoever we are, whatever we do, we've got to find a way to make a difference. That is what I believe. I got that from my parents. You don't just sit here on this earth and just stand and watch, or even just stand and watch and talk and complain. You find a way to make a difference. And as a writer, that is what I will use. That's what I use to make a difference. And my other thing is the nonprofit that I have, the Celebrate Maya Project. I use that to help change the dynamics for young people. These are our future leaders. We need to prepare them for that leadership, for their future. We need to prepare them, make sure they have that foundation, reading, writing, math, public speaking, all the things that they're going to need to have. But we also need to make sure that we empower them, make sure they know their voices are, invaluable, and help them to raise their voices and identify their voices. So we have a lot of responsibilities. Yeah, we're hoping to prepare future leaders, but we, in our own perspectives, have a lot of responsibility to help make that a reality.
Shadia, can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing with the students at Antioch around this topic, and specifically leadership?
So I think two big pieces for me that stand out. Number one, and I think everybody, is experiencing this, the lack of belief in institutions, that in my world, I grew up with the belief that institutions are here to help us, and that even if they have some problems and they need to be fixed, they still are supposed to serve the people. I think our young people are growing up questioning whether that's true. And so that means there's some work there to be done, right? Not just in deciding whether institutions are good, bad, indifferent, not, workable, but also in deciding back to what Janis said, how can we get young people to see themselves as agents and responsible for creating that, right? Not just saying, I don't like it, I don't want to deal with it, I'm disconnecting, because that's not realistic either. And the second thing is this thing around faith. And this idea that when I look at the life of Coretta, when I look at the life of Maya, when I look at Miss Bates, I see that very strong belief in faith, in working through community. And I worry that right now, because we're deluged with so much information, some real and some not, we are losing our ability to have a conversation across, right, multiple aisles, I'll say that, but also to be able to trust that I don't have to be the ones to resolve it all, right? And I think that that's the other piece that I keep looking at and trying to, and so what we've done, we've started to create a lot of what we call story circles and democracy circles, where we bring together students, high school students specifically, and talk about what it is that they are perceiving. What are the issues that they care about? What is it that's going on? Does democracy still work? Do they understand democracy, right? Because what they're getting from TV, social media, etc., paints a very different narrative. And the last thing I'll say, just because my background, as rebellious as I was, I will tell you, I became a teacher and then a principal. So But I will say also that this idea of being able to help students discern truth, primary source, versus anything that someone posts is becoming really important at this time. So I wonder what would Coretta have written on Twitter. So,
Janis, you look like you've got something to say.
No, I'm fascinated and I'm encouraged by Shadia, all that you're doing with students there. That is the kind of education that they need. Education that's just not always inside those books, but it's about the future and reality. So I'm grateful for that, to know that you're doing that.
Yeah, when I look at just the history in my lifetime, whether it was the killing of President Kennedy or Martin or Malcolm or Bobby in the 1960s, the divorce rate, Watergate, Iran-Contra, I mean, all of the things that happen in a relatively brief 20-year period of time eroded our confidence in our ability in our institutions and in our leadership. And it's only seemingly gotten worse and worse, faster and faster. And I know as a parent of two young people, it's challenging to help them understand and make sense of the world and what can and should they believe in. And it puts even more pressure on and responsibility for the right kind of leadership in the world. And so, using social media or some of the activities and the things we're witnessing in Washington in particular has really destabilized our society.
Yes, absolutely. Which means that we do have more responsibility. I mean, I'm a grandparent, so I have responsibility, but younger parents definitely do. I think more so than we did 40 years ago, 30 years ago, because we've got to navigate so much noise and so much negativity. And we've got to make children understand that it's real, but it isn't what most Americans believe. You would think it is. You would think it is when you see it on social media and you see people talking heads talk about it, but you've got to make children understand the difference.
Yeah. So in this moment in time, and it's a completely unfair question, but what would Daisy, what would Maya, what would Coretta say? What would they be speaking to right now?
Oh, goodness. I think we'd hear some 4-letter words from both Maya and Daisy for sure, because they would be, well, let's just say Daisy, because she died in 1999, and Maya passed away in 2014. So they saw some of it, coming. But I think Daisy Bates for sure would be so saddened to see that all of the things that she did so much work to remove from our society and communities, that it's rearing its ugly head, it's back, and in some ways it's worse. So it just tells us how hard the job is to keep moving forward, to keep making change lasting. So she would be very disappointed. And of course, Maya was very outspoken. She would be extremely disappointed and tell us what our responsibility is. So yeah, 2 women who both stood up for right and good would be very disappointed and saddened.
And it's funny. I think that I think we're lucky. I'll say that Dr. Bernice King, one of Coretta's daughters, has taken up the mantle and has, really, really done some amazing work with the King Center, and is now, there's even, I think, workshops on Zoom on the nonviolence principles and the Kingian nonviolence principles that they believed in. I think that this would be a moment where they would say, we have to focus not just on the streets, but we also have to focus on the folks that are inside of these systems. And we really have to create bridges, because at this point, we're no longer at a place where we can look away. I don't think we ever were, but I think in some senses as a society, we took different moments, and now it just feels like it's all imploding. And that's really hard, particularly for folks that, we're resolving things in relationships, and now relationships are harder to come by. But at the end of the day, we know that most things get resolved when there's a healthy relationship. So I think Coretta would have a lot to say, and I'm glad Bernice is taking the helm. We have a lot of work.
I'd like to return to where we started, just the 2 of you and your personal journeys. And speaking of work, what are you both working on right now? What's calling you? What are you passionate about?
Well, definitely the Celebrate Maya project is my passion. I spend a lot of time working to create programming, my board and I, for youth. Especially, we have kind of we're focusing now on students who lost so much during COVID. And those were the students that are our target students, the ones who had less from the beginning. We know that they are still suffering 3 years out, and we're getting ready to expand our programming into more intentional programming like mentoring and one-on-one tutoring and soft skills and social emotional behavior sessions. So that is really important to me. Again, we are talking about our future leaders. So if we want to be a safety net, not the only safety net, there has to be many, but that is very important to us. We can't expect these children to become leaders and effective leaders if they don't have that foundation. So we want to be a part of that. We're working hard to be a part of that. And the other thing is my writing. Again, I take it very seriously. I think you cannot write and not address the issues that we're dealing with from day to day. So I always try to find a way to talk about what's going on and leave it to the reader to hopefully come up with great ways to get out of where we are right now.
Right now, at the Coretta Scott King Center, we're working on 3 key initiatives. The first one is what I described earlier, the story circles with Village Commons, where we bring students together, both college, high school, and talk about the things they want to talk about, right? It's a very loose framework that allows for them to be able to guide the process. The other one is the Getting to the Root. It's a 2-day racial justice and human rights workshop where we walk participants through a 2-day process of understanding history and the construction of racism, not just as an individual thing, but as an institutional and systemic issue in our society. And we do it both on Zoom and in person. And then the third one is we're putting programming together on Coretta's life. We believe that her story can serve to inspire. And if you look at the King Center, there's a video done by Bernice that talks about her mom. It's beautiful. And so we believe that that kind of programming will keep Coretta's legacy alive, and that the more we share her story, the more we are creating vehicles for other people to see themselves as those very same change agents, for lack of a better word. And I'll add that in the chat.
The next area I just wanted to spend a few minutes on. So the way I hold history, and it goes back to some of Jim's opening comments, is that history's always been written by the victors. And with social media, with sort of the light side of what technology has allowed, it's allowed the democratization of the telling of history in a way that we've never had before. Yes, people kept diaries, and you've got filmmakers like Ken Burns and others and historians who've gone back and looked at the journeys of and the journals of individual citizens to get a better, more holistic picture of history. But when we look at this moment in time that we're going through, for the two of you, when we fast forward 20, 30, 50 years from now, assuming we're still around, how will this moment in time be told by the historians, and who's going to be telling that story?
I think, thankfully, you're seeing a lot more history being told through the eyes of people of color, people who have been the victims of our history, immigrants, women. So I think it will be people who read it 50 years from now will read a different American history, world history, than we read it, than I read it. So I'm grateful for that. And I think a lot has to do with what's going on, as we've talked about, the political environment, what we saw during the COVID pandemic, what we saw that told us that things aren't as in good a shape as we thought they were. I think it peeled back a lot of misbeliefs, misconceptions about where we are as a people. We're not as far ahead as we thought we were. So that's what a lot of people are writing about now. That is the truths that we need in our history books. And I'm grateful for that.
Thank you, Janice. And I'm going to go another way. I'm always telling my students, where'd you get that information? TikTok University? I'm always making fun of them because I never know where the information's coming from. And my goal is to teach them that they have to be able to look for information from various sources, not just, whatever app they're using for that day. But I say that, in a funny, in a humorous way, but I also say that because the amount of information that is now out there it's unrelenting. And so I think that in some ways we have to figure out how to create spaces for us to be able to reflect. And I'm thinking more of the higher education kind of community model, in the same way that you opened today with the breathing exercise. It's almost the same thing, but for our day-to-day life. It almost requires, particularly with, I'll speak, for young people, being able to say, okay, let's slow this down. Let's reflect on everything that you're consuming, and then let's make some sense of it. Because I think that this moment is just so intense. And I think that we take for granted how much our young people are absorbing. Because we're in this kind of adult world. We're not realizing how fast they're getting the information, faster than us. And that's where I want the whole world to do some breathing exercises.
I'd like to, before we invite Jim back in, I'd like to just spend a couple of minutes about tomorrow and Wednesday.
Tomorrow, are you asking us, Tom, to talk about it?
Yeah, if we can just, for those of us who are going to be joining again tomorrow and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday, if you could just share a little bit about your thinking and what went into our conversations for planning for tomorrow and Wednesday.
Well, I personally am excited about tomorrow and Wednesday, especially tomorrow. I get to highlight and feature two women who I absolutely believe helped change this world for the better, Daisy Bates and Maya Angelou. And I want to share stories. I think I try to find stories that the average person does not know about these women, but also how they instill things in our society that we never probably would give them credit for. So I'm looking forward to sharing their lives and how they are part of American history. An important part of American history, and how they impacted my life personally.
Thank you. I am also excited. I would love to share more on Coretta's life and give, specific instances where I think that she, she became a transformational leader by virtue of the context she was in, but also by virtue of her experiences. And I think that being able to share that adds some additional substance to the conversation we're having today and helps us build up as we go through. So Coretta, some beautiful quotes to share with you.
Well, Jim, I'd like to have you rejoin us and finish off our program for today with just some thoughts or questions that are showing up for you.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you, Shadia and Janis. I can hardly wait for the next couple of days. I hadn't taken in, Janis, till you mentioned it, that Maya Angelou's birthday and Martin Luther King's death day were the same day.
Yes.
That's an extraordinary thing to take in. I want to pick up something that you said about your students, Shadia, which I think opens up a very fertile domain about leadership. When I was a young man, I'm one of the boomers, the parents were saying, that get involved, the institutions are serving the people, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a lot of problems with that. But there was a general belief, and I think also for Martin Luther King and Coretta King during the 60s and 70s, that in fact, the institutions were reformable. Mm-hmm. That in fact, if you passed the Voting Rights Act, as they did in 1965, it was actually going to make a difference. Mm-hmm. I think the cynicism of the young people today is of a different order. And I'd love to have both of you comment on that, because I think their sense that the institutions are no longer redeemable is actually correct. And I'd like to unpack that just for a moment at two levels. One is climate change. And I've been in the climate movement, for the last 30 years, and we were doing everything we could to try to get the governments to do something. Well, we've had 27 Conference of Parties, and the governments haven't done anything. And it was actually in 2 years ago in the Glasgow Conference of Parties that I think the environmental movement finally woke up to the reality the governments are not going to do anything. And that presented the climate movement with an extraordinary challenge, because a problem that should be solved by governments isn't going to be solved by governments. The situation's getting worse and worse. Climate disasters are proliferating all over the world. What do we, the people, need to do in the absence of institutional capacity? We saw it just last week with artificial intelligence. If you've seen Social Dilemma, the Netflix documentary about how social media and the corporate interests and the algorithms are now intentionally manipulating reality in an extraordinary way, in the face of which we consumers have almost no defenses. And now artificial intelligence is taking something that was already exponential and taking the exponential. And Elon Musk and Steve Wozniak and 1,000 CEOs of tech companies around the world came out with a letter to the Institute for the Human Future, who had been really instrumental in developing the documentary on social media several years ago, and now are talking in the same way about artificial intelligence. And the point they made was the governments aren't going to do anything about this. So we, the tech industry, have to do it on our own. And maybe after we do something, the governments will respond. So I would love to hear both of you comment on what this means in terms of leadership generally, but women's leadership, particularly at a moment, since you're women of color, where the racial situation is also deconstructing, and the government is now being governed by one of the major parties, which is getting more and more explicit about white supremacy and racial rhetoric and so forth as well. So in the middle of this, with escalating crises around us, institutions failing us, it feels to me that the very definition of leadership and the definition of civic engagement and democracy are going through a deconstruction and a transformation. And I'm just wondering how you're experiencing that, and how you would counsel young people or anyone out there as to how they can actually make a difference in that kind of a world.
Shadia, you want to go first?
There's so many levels to this conversation, Jim. This is almost another 5 days.
Yeah.
We could really go deep on this one. So
Please do.
I think the first part, the hesitance of, I would say, and I'm saying young people just because that's who I work with. That's the population most I'm most connected to, but the hesitation in their belief in institutions is both exciting and worrisome at the same time, right? Because on the one hand, they're asking amazing questions and expecting things that I, in my mind, would not have expected at their age, right? And on the other, they're saying, well, just throw it all out. And I'm saying, well, you can't kind of do that. Like, you can't just throw everything out. And they're saying, well, why not? And I'm saying, I don't know why not. But it just sounds like we need to think about this, right? And I'm walking you through like my actual experiences. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I'm truly concerned that the way that most of our institutions in the nation came together was at a time that we as a nation look so different, that it's almost like we keep putting Band-Aids on all these issues, trying to figure out how we can serve climate change, how we can serve disability rights, how we can serve LGBTQ people, how we can. But the question that we are not asking is, and this is back to why we do the Getting to the Root workshop, what's the root cause of these institutions not being able to serve everyone so that when you walk into these institutions, you're whole and complete? And what is it? What is the value system that is operating that does not allow us to be able to create a new institution? You know, why is that so scary for us as a society? So those are the things that keep me up at night. Those are things that I think about, right? The flip side of that, I will say, though, is that particularly, at least for me, in the community that I come from, the immigrant community, Black community, newly immigrated to this country, our understanding of the construction of what I'll say American society, for lack of a better word, requires so much time, you know, and what ends up happening to us oftentimes is that we'll come in from another country, we won't really know how United States is constructed, we'll start blaming each other, and that's where we end up not being able to all fight for climate justice, right? Because now we're all infighting, we're all trying to get our piece of the pie, but we don't realize that the climate justice issue is going to kill all of us no matter what side we're on, right? So that's, you know, I mean, and I'm just broad strokes here. That's just me thinking about how do we think anew, given the constraints and even our own thinking? How do we challenge our own thinking? You know, I could go on, but that's just a little bit of broad strokes. I don't know if you have more questions, but that was, you know, what came to mind. Janis?
Yeah, I think, Jim, I cannot address all of your questions, and I'm not sure we have the answers to them, but I was thinking, as you were talking about our institutions, that maybe we should think back to how this country got started. The things that were important then, and we have to remember that there was destruction of humanity. That was part of it. And there was greed, and there was the otherness that was a big part of how our country got started. So it's nothing new, but it's something that has continued. The very things that made us great as a country are the things that's today destroying us as humanity, as humans. And the other thing is that institutions that we think are not perfect are because they were built by people, and they were built by people who didn't always have everybody in mind when those institutions were built. It was not built by perfect human beings. So there's no way that they could be perfect or work for everyone. because they weren't built for that. And I think that's what we have to deal with now. I think what we do is, as much as we can, we teach our children to be good human beings. That how we save a world and save a country is to be the best human beings that we can possibly be, and make everything we do for the benefit of all, for the benefit of the world, making the world better, sustainable. And that they have a responsibility, not just to themselves. Let's not perpetuate this greed and selfishness that our country was built on. Let's teach children that they have a responsibility to people other than themselves. And I think that is a beginning. I think Martin Luther King said it, whatever it is that you do, you start there and you do it to the best of your ability, and not just for yourself, but to make this world better. So I think there, as Shadia said, your questions were so deep and something that we all need to be thinking about. And I don't think any of us have the answers to them, but it's definitely important for us to start instilling in our young people.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, both of you. I mean, it's something that we ponder on Humanity Rising because, like you, we see the general situation going from bad to worse in almost every category. Occasionally, there'll be glimpses, as we were celebrating last week when we were talking about democracy and governance, where, for example, the indictment of Donald Trump tomorrow in a New York court is a real triumph of democracy in this country, in a demonstration that no one's above the law.
Right.
And we'll see how it plays out. But it's again against a backdrop of the Republicans and pretty systemic erosions of democracy in state after state, particularly in terms of women's rights, for example, where the assault on women's rights, because it's been now taken from the federal level down to the state level, is making it even more difficult to get at the underlying issues that you're talking about. So the question of how we act in a way that is effective enough to turn the tide is just something that we ponder a lot on Humanity Rising. And I appreciate both of you. This is a demonstration of humility. There's no real answers out there that have emerged to anybody with sufficient clarity to create a critical mass of certainty. So we're all groping, I would say, in a situation that is increasingly complicated and made even more so now by artificial intelligence and social media. So you don't even know what's true anymore.
Right.
And Shadia, as an educator, as at Ubiquity University, what you're grappling with is issues that 40 years ago we had all a general sense of what truth is. And now it's no longer so clear. And I have two sons, millennials, and and I experience, as you do as an educator, some of the complexities where answers no longer suffice to the probing questions that they're asking. And so I just want to acknowledge that. And then I would, as we draw this to a close, I think another question that just comes to my mind to each of you is how you've personally navigated through this radically changing reality of ours. What is there a particular practice that you employ? Is there a philosophy that gives you strength? Is it a church group? Is it a community? You know, where do you draw strength to give you the capacity to be such extraordinary women? Because you're obviously not being beaten down by reality, you're being empowered by it. And I'd love to hear just how you're doing it.
Very briefly, I think I get up each day with a sense of gratitude for all that's been given me, for my roots that allowed me to navigate to where I am now, when a lot of people would have thought, no way would I have been able to do that. So that sense of gratitude really kind of is the basis of who I am and why I do what I do. And from there, it's like, what can I do? I mean, I don't have a whole bunch of skills and talents, but what is it that I can do that can make a difference? Maybe not in the whole world, but maybe for just a group, maybe a community, maybe a child. So those are the things that are very important to me. Doing what I can to make a difference each and every day. Being able to go to bed and saying, I think I've made a difference in someone's life, or I've started that. So the gratitude and the sense of responsibility that I need to each and every day work toward making a difference. That's how I navigate.
Beautiful. Thank you. Beautiful.
I would say the same thing. You know, COVID, like many of us, hit rock bottom, and what I had to do is create a daily practice of just walking outside with the trees, feet on the ground. I needed to feel Mother Earth in some kind of way, because I was lost in the amount of deaths we experienced in New York City, the anxiety that I was watching my children's take in as a result of all the virtual learning, on top of just all the political back and forth. And so I think reconnecting with, Mother Earth was big for me. I also think that community, good food and good music, are a balm for those of us doing this work. Good food, good music, good people around you, because it's not easy, but it has to be done. So
beautiful, beautiful answers. Thank you so much. You're both inspiring. I'm really looking forward to the next couple of days. Tom, any final comment?
I'll try and be brief. It would be difficult given the nature of the wide-ranging conversation we've had today. I noticed several comments in the chat today. People just feeling sad with the level of ignorance that exists in the world, and it's just so painful because it doesn't have to be that way. And I just want to honor that is present, that does exist. It's certainly part of the reason for being for Humanity Rising is to help elevate the human species. So I'm just incredibly grateful, Janis and Shadia, for joining us today. Really looking forward to our conversation tomorrow and celebrating Maya and Daisy's lives, and then on Wednesday with Coretta's life. So thank you both for being with us today, and all of the work that went into planning the week. So thank you, and really looking forward to tomorrow.
thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Janis. Thank you, Shadia. More to come, everyone, as we really celebrate women's histories of changing the world and shaping our lives. It's a very important encounter with something that we normally don't think about as we read the news. That'll bring us to a close for today. You're all welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. And then we'll see you tomorrow for day 2 of this 5-day program on women's histories of changing the world. So Shadia, Janis, thank you so much, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.